Turbulence in the skies. The Gulf crisis is giving airlines in the region a headache. 4 Arab states ban Qatar from using their airspace. But is it legal, and can the global aviation authorities navigate a smooth path out of the standoff? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. The air embargo by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt on Qatar is now into its second week. Qatar is calling the move by its Arab neighbours illegal. It's called on the world aviation watchdog ICAO to intervene. So what does the ban actually mean for flights in the region? Well, state-owned Qatar Airways and other Qatari registered aircraft are blocked from flying into Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia and UAE have placed a total ban on using their airspace, while Bahrain is allowing a narrow corridor for incoming and outgoing flights. Qatar Airways says 18 destinations in the 4 countries are now off limits, about 50 flights a day, and many are being rerouted over Iran, Turkey and Oman. That means longer flight paths using more fuel. A Qatar Airways flight from Doha to Khartoum, for example, now takes twice as long. Other Gulf airlines are also affected. The Center for Aviation says 16 flights by carriers in the UAE are no longer touching down in Doha. Well, earlier this week, the chief executive of Qatar Airways, Akbar Al-Bakr, spoke to our correspondent Andrew Simmons and said Qatar will stand its ground.
Individuals have climbed on a tree which is very tall, and now to get down from this tree, they will be injured. My country will persevere.
This is not a situation that's going to be over quickly, is it?
We have taken a moral high ground. We have not acted in the way others have acted. Emiratis, Saudis, Egyptians can live here peacefully. Emirates, Etihad, Saudi Arabian Airlines, Egypt Air, they can operate their offices openly. They can bring in and transfer money out normally. So we are taking the moral high ground because the country has very wise leadership. When you split loved ones, when you have to remove your children from schools, when you have to block your funds that you need to repatriate for your family that are on the other side are of needs, do you think these people will forget? This is a wound that has been created for a generation. This will never be forgotten. I'm not a politician. Again, there are certain parts of this question should be answered by the political echelons of my country. But one thing I can tell you, regardless if it lasts less or long, the wound has already been very deep, and people will not forget.
So can countries put a ban on using their airspace? Well, according to the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which regulates global air travel, for reasons of military necessity or public safety, countries can restrict or prohibit flying over their territory, but it must make no distinction between its planes and those of other nations who are signatories to the UN Convention. And the ban must be reasonable so that it does not interfere unnecessarily with air navigation. The restrictions must also be communicated to affected countries and also through ICAO. Let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Bergerac via Skype, Alan Peaford, Editor-in-Chief of Arabian Aerospace and Aviation Industry magazine. Here in Doha, we have Shehata, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations Program at the Doha Institute. And in London, we have Alex Macheras, Aviation Analyst and Airline Trend Specialist. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Welcome. Alan Peaford, let me start with you then. What implications is all of this having, not just for Qatar, but for global aviation as a whole?
Well, it's certainly hitting the Middle East aviation at the worst possible time. It's been a bad period for the Gulf. We're seeing other carriers in other parts of the world actually picking up and doing well, but the Middle East is suffering a little bit anyway. And it's not good for either side. And I don't think it's something that the airlines want. I can understand Mr. Al-Bakr's views on this and being quite harsh, but I don't think it's something that the airlines per se in the rest of the Gulf would have actually wanted to happen. It's bad for aviation.
And what Qatar is trying to do here in appealing to the aviation authorities is connected with what is known as the Chicago Convention, which was an international agreement signed back in 1962. How does that relate to what we're seeing right now?
Well, it's an interesting point, but it's a legal point, and I think this is one that ICAO itself is going to have to determine whether it's in breach. I mean, I know we're talking about it being a unique event. I'm not convinced it is. But it's up to ICAO to determine if the airspace rules are being broken.
Alex Macheras, what authority does Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all of these countries have to do this? Are they on solid ground here? I mean, we mentioned before we came to you some of the reasons why a particular country would deny airspace to another country. What case do they have here?
Well, as your guest quite rightfully said, in terms of ICAO and the legalities and the agreements that are in place, you have the Chicago Convention and you also have the Transit Agreement. And the countries are kind of signed up to this, and the Chicago Convention permits basically takeoffs and landings within that country, per signature. And the Transit Agreement applies to overflight, and that's really where it applies to this Qatar crisis, as it's being referred to. Are these countries neighbouring to Qatar allowed to ban Qatari registered aircraft from flying through their airspace? And if you are basing it purely on the transit agreement, then for example with Bahrain and with the UAE, no, that's not allowed. They have signed the transit agreement. This is a legally binding agreement by ICAO, who are the UN body for aviation. However, is there a kind of a police force enforcing, this convention, this agreement? No, there isn't. It's kind of a grey area when it becomes so diplomatic and on such a larger scale between countries. And this is, I think, the stress that Mr. Al-Bakr, the CEO of Qatar Airways, is putting on, because he's saying quite rightfully, this isn't fair. This convention is there to avoid situations like this. It has been signed by Bahrain and by the UAE, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to close their airspace.
But it hasn't been signed by Saudi Arabia, has it? So what sort of ground are they on here?
Well, as you correctly said, they have not been signed. It has not been signed by Saudi Arabia. So essentially, Saudi Arabia can just close its airspace to Qatari registered aircraft, which it has done, and it also will not permit overflight. Now, in terms of how this will impact Qatar Airways, Saudi Arabia is actually one of two of the largest markets for the airline. It's even bigger than India. So this will impact the airline. However, they have managed it very well. I spent the whole of last week in Doha in Qatar, and I took a flight that was specifically affected by the new route and by the restrictions due to airspace, which should have flown through Saudi Arabia, but instead we tracked north via Iran over to Turkey and down into Cypriot airspace. They simply said that it was something that they were having to address. They loaded more fuel, and although this wouldn't be sustainable, everybody I spoke to in Qatar was quite sure that this would be resolved soon.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more then with Alan Peaford then. What sort of what are the economic costs of this going to be, particularly for Qatar? I mean, we showed the map there about the having to reroute many of these flights, the extra distance and the extra fuel. This is going to cost them more, and presumably that's going to be passed on to air travelers at some point.
Well, it's certainly going to cost more because there will be fuel. And also because of that, they're going to be trying to go a bit faster so they can keep to the published schedules, which and credit to Qatar Airways. They've been doing it very, very well. I think it's something like 95% that something has been kept exactly as it should have been. So that's working quite well. It's not unusual in the industry. If you think about Iraq and various conflict zones have required airlines to take different routes to avoid certain areas. They plan that anyway. So in fact, for Qatar, what they're doing is flying effectively the same as if there was a conflict zone. They're having to fly round the areas rather than across it. So it's something that's already within their program to do, but it's not sustainable. They're not going to be able to keep flying across to Iran in order to get to Algeria. It just doesn't make economic sense unless prices are going to rise. And the last thing that Qatar Airways can afford to do is increase their prices. What they are doing, I think, will be quite interesting is how they use the aircraft that they're not using to fly dozens of times a day to places in the UAE or to Saudi Arabia. And that is creating some opportunity for them.
All right, let's bring in Samer Shehata now. Samer, this whole area of the airspace is just one facet of a very large diplomatic spat here. But in terms of the bigger picture here, do we see any sort of momentum of this being resolved at any point?
I think even before we get to that, getting back to the bigger picture, I mean, this is a conflict. In fact, it's not a diplomatic dispute, it's a conflict, and it's in some senses a war, but a war by other means, and this is part of the economic war. And I think it is having some consequences and disruption of people's lives. And I think what's interesting to note is that Qatar Airways has been part of the branding initiative of the state of Qatar, along with the sponsoring of Barcelona, along with the Al Jazeera media network, along with the World Cup and so on. And I think it is going to, unfortunately, have an adverse effect on Qatar Airways as well. I mean, there are people whose lives are going to be disrupted because, not necessarily because of Qatar Airways, but because of the inability to get to where they want to go in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. People who fly through here to go someplace else or have to go to the Emirates to fly to Europe and so on. But again, this is probably part of the calculation. Will this conflict be resolved in the near future? It's not clear. It doesn't seem like the parties are willing to make concessions, either in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, or whatever concessions are being asked of the Qataris in Doha. And of course, we have an American administration that is itself confused or dysfunctional and so on, with the Secretary of State saying one thing and the President saying another. And so I don't think that they are clearly resolved to work, number one, on the resolution of this issue, particularly with all that is going on in Washington.
Yeah, on the question of where the U.S. stands on this, we have the news that Qatar has just made the announcement of this deal to buy F-15s from the United States. Does that suggest that the U.S. is moving away from the position that Donald Trump took before, which was putting pressure on Qatar? Where does that leave things?
I think if there hadn't been confusion before, then one could read it that way. But unfortunately, there's been confusion from the beginning. There were the tweets that were critical of Qatar, and then there was the statement that President Trump made after the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, made a statement about the blockade and the humanitarian situation and so on. So there have been all kinds of mixed signals, as it were. I think it would be wrong to say that this means this latest agreement, which seems to have been in the works for years and not something that is new, represents a change of position. But I also think it represents that something that the U.S. does not want this to get so much out of hand. Clearly, they are committed to Qatar to some extent, to a large extent, because of the Al Udeid Air Force Base here, as well as the sales of military equipment and so on. So conflict can continue. Hopefully it'll be resolved, but it shouldn't escalate. I think that's what we can read out of it.
Is that the biggest thing that Qatar has in its cards? Is the U.S. airbase on its territory?
Well, I mean, one could think, if there was a kind of law that we could apply throughout history, that countries are not invaded if they have a U.S. Air Force base, right? That might be the case. And I think certainly having Al Udeid here, being a major supplier of natural gas and so on, has proven to be more effective than the soft power initiatives that Qatar has tried to cultivate over the last 10 or 15 years. That is Al Jazeera, FIFA 2022, Qatar Airways, and so on.
If I could turn back to Alex Macheras on this. We heard that the CEO of Qatar Airways there talking about the human impact of all of this, people's lives being disrupted as a result of this. Talk a little bit more about some of the logistical challenges this has presented for people. Like, for example, many of the expats who live here in Qatar and want to travel back to their home countries in the Middle East, what effect that's having on them when they want to book flights. Flights are not available, they've got to take a longer route, all of that.
Well, as you can imagine, there's many implications for passengers visiting Qatar, for those flying through, for those wanting to leave and go to possibly neighbouring Gulf countries. And hats off to Qatar Airways, because they have handled this very, very well, given the tiny amount of time that they were given. It was almost the next day, and where a normal airline, another airline, would be trying to figure out, okay, this is the plan and this is how we'll do it. It seems that Qatar Airways were ready with trying to help out with the situation almost overnight. So there are other routing options. For example, if you're wanting to go to the United Arab Emirates and you're an expat and you're currently in Qatar, then you can do so by going via Kuwait or via Oman, which of course is not ideal, but it is still possible. On the other hand, in terms of how it's affecting the airline, it is business as usual at the airline, apart from the obvious closures of Saudi Arabia, so no flights there, and the other countries mentioned, including Bahrain and UAE with Egypt. But will this affect the airline in the long term, or how it's running day-to-day operations now? Not really. I mean, there's still, just yesterday, 2 days ago, the first flight to Dublin direct with Qatar Airways was launched. We've got the new state-of-the-art business class joining the Qatar Airways fleet later this month. So things are normal on this side of the airline. Can this be sustainable in the Gulf and with these tensions causing such implications on the airline? Of course not. But will things become resolved? Well, everybody I spoke to in Qatar yesterday seemed quite sure that with Bahrain already easing some of their airspace restrictions, this could be the first step in the right direction.
Alan, Peaford, what do you think this is going to do, not just for Qatar Airways, but for the other Gulf airlines like Etihad and Emirates and so on? Presumably they're going to take an economic hit as well here, aren't they?
Well, they're missing out on the flights they do to Doha. That's the challenge for them. But actually, I think there is a bigger problem. The external perception of the Gulf is always a little bit confusing outside, because so many people associate the different countries with all being in the same place, and probably part of Saudi Arabia anyway. So when we have these kind of challenges happening and things are affecting the airlines, the perception can be greater. And so when people have a choice, they're not necessarily going to choose the Gulf carriers again. And that's the issue, I think, that if this drags on any further, we could see people turning away. So the forward bookings start to drop down. We know Emirates, I've already said today, their forward bookings are dropping. It's a challenge. They've had a big enough problem with the US and the laptops issue. They've got an additional problem that they can't expand in China anymore because they've got a 6-month ban on them, from yesterday. So there are problems in the Gulf. And so as people outside, if you're in Europe or in Asia and you're going to go somewhere and there is a choice, do you choose to go with a Gulf airline, irrespective of whether it's from Abu Dhabi, from the UAE, from Qatar, or from Kuwait or anywhere else? Do you actually avoid the Middle East airlines? So that's an underlying worry if this goes on any further. The reputation of the Gulf for being the place for a quick transit and a reasonably priced in top quality airlines could be at risk.
Yeah, what about that, Samra? This affects not just the Qatari brand, but the Gulf brand as a whole. And with these airlines, the three big ones, Qatar Airways, Etihad, and Emirates, they're known for providing a very good quality service. What sort of damage is that going to do for them?
Well, I think that's right, and I think we can expand it even further. We've seen, I believe, the credit rating be downgraded recently and so on, and one wonders what someone will think if they have an offer to come to the region, if they don't know the region. They used to think of this region as incredibly stable and so on, and now if they don't know the specifics, they might think once and twice about coming here, either for a job or otherwise. So I do think that there is a longer term cost in which everyone loses, unfortunately, not just Qatar Airways, but Etihad, Emirates, and the other airlines involved.
And just going back to the diplomatic aspect of this, we know Turkey, which has supported Qatar in a number of ways up to this point, supplying goods and food and so on. They are making efforts on the mediation front as well. What are the prospects there?
Well, of course, Turkey's regional weight is much larger than Kuwait's, even though Kuwait is part of the GCC. And of course, Turkey has very important political and diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. And so the hope is, or the one would think that Turkey could somehow either exert a little pressure, as it were, on Saudi Arabia, or be a more effective mediator. And that might be the case. Of course, the Turks have a special relationship with Doha at the personal level and in the countries as well. And of course, Turkey also has relations with Iran that are mutually beneficial. So there is a hope that the Turkish negotiation efforts might be more fruitful.
And even if there is some sort of agreement, it does seem that there are deep differences that will remain here.
I think this is one of the major takeaways. We can effectively say that the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, will no longer be the GCC of past. I don't think it'll be effective anymore. As the interview with the CEO of Qatar Airways expressed, I can't imagine that there will be feelings of trust at the governmental level, or maybe even at the population level, between the citizens of the GCC countries. And so that is really quite an incredible development. I mean, this is the most significant Arab political diplomatic development since August 2, 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, in terms of inter-Arab relations and so on. And I think there are going to be consequences of that, whether that means a better position for Iran because the GCC is no longer coherent, a weaker position for the United States because all of these are allies of the United States, supposedly engaging in the war on terrorism and so on, and there are divisions among them. But there are, I think, significant geopolitical consequences of this.
Alex Macheras, what sort of damage do you think all this is doing to the Gulf and the Middle East as a brand and as a destination for air travel?
As both of your guests have said, it is about, you have to think about the reputation. You know, when passengers are booking to fly, for example, from Australia to London, some of them don't specifically know the countries that make up the Gulf, you know, and they don't really differentiate Qatar, UAE, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Saudi as all these separate places. Some just see it as the Middle East. And so if these conflicts develop and if it does get worse and resolutions aren't in place, then of course, you know, I've already had people message me on Twitter who are based in Australia and say, well, I'm not sure if I can be bothered with the hassle of booking to fly via the Middle East, you know, this winter in a few months, because I'm not sure how the situation will develop. So I'll go via Singapore instead. And then, you know, if you get passengers basing their bookings on that theory, then this is damaging to all of the Gulf and to all of the airlines as a reputation that they have set so high. The Middle Eastern airlines, Etihad, Qatar, Emirates, they hold the status in the aviation industry of providing one of the best services in the skies and going from the Middle East to the rest of the world. So I think it's in all of their best interests to get this resolved as soon as possible so that they're able to maintain that global identity and that great brand that they have all equally established.
I'll give what's going to be the final word to you then, Alan Peaford. How do you see this playing out? Do you think there's going to be a solution to this anytime soon? The longer the economic effects of this continue to bite?
I certainly hope there's going to be a solution soon. And I, you know, speaking to people in Bahrain, I know there's a kind of wish underneath that it gets resolved. But I worry in the same message that Akbar al-Bakr said, is this is going to be remembered for generations. In the Gulf, we have a challenge coming up in terms of the amount of aircraft that are likely to be using the airspace, assuming growth is allowed to continue. We need to get airspace managed, and there's been a lot of work done over recent years to try and get that shared airspace idea. I worry about how countries are going to feel about sharing or giving up responsibility for the international airspace in the event that things like this can happen.
That is going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all three of you, Alan Peaford, Alex Macheras, and Samer Shehata. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.